Hello and welcome once again to the last program in our winter horticulture series with the Camden Garden Club. I am now going to turn the program over to Deborah Stokes. She's the president of the Camden Garden Club, and she's here today to tell you a little bit about their organization and to introduce today's speaker. Deborah, take it away.
Thank you, Julia, and good morning, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to the fifth and the final presentation in this year's winter horticultural series. If you're not familiar with the Garden Club yet, we promote gardening to its fullest, support civic improvements, and the conservation of natural resources in our communities. We are certainly looking forward to a warmer weather when our geranium baskets can be hung from the downtown lamppost, and the flower boxes and beds that you see in so many places around town can be planted, and we start looking like there's spring again. Currently, the Garden Club is gearing up for our selection of our scholarship recipients, local high school graduates who plan to major in one of the natural sciences. And as mentioned before, work has already started on this year's garden tour. It will be held in July, the third Thursday in July, on July 21st. I want to thank everyone who has joined us today, and especially you who have joined us for the past 5 weeks. If you have found these programs worthwhile, and if you're interested in doing more in the community, consider joining the Camden Garden Club. The rewards of joining us far outweighs the pleasures of growing things. Membership opens the doors for you to explore a wide range of common interests with people around your local community. And you can find out more about us at camdengardenclub.org. And now a little bit about our speaker. Liz Stanley coordinates the adult and youth gardening programs and answers countless gardening calls for the University of Maine Cooperative Extension in Knox, Lincoln, and Waldo Counties. Her main focus is the Master Gardener Volunteer Program, where participants receive over 50 hours of training in the art and science of horticulture. In return, the volunteers support school and community gardens, food security initiatives, and environmental projects. Now today, Liz will introduce many of us to Lasagna Gardening, or sheet mulching. This is a technique that has been used around the world for generations. She will show you examples of lasagna gardens, what kind of recipes are used, and which plants thrive in this environment. So now, please welcome Liz Stanley.
Thank you, everybody, and the Camden Garden Club for having me today, and also for Julia at the Camden Library for driving this program. Today, I'm going to talk about sheet mulching and lasagna gardening. I'm going to share my screen and talk a little bit about this type of garden program.
It looks good, by the way, Liz.
Okay, good. Everybody can see it. Everybody thinks of gardens sort of in the row method, but there are a lot of easier ways for home gardeners that can grow. And lasagna gardening is one of those methods. So hopefully you can see all the photos on the right. And what is lasagna gardening? It's a term that was coined in 1998 by Patricia Lanza. I remember reading it and I thought, boy, this sounds like a really great idea. But way back when I was a kid, I remember we had neighbors that sort of used the same technique. The permaculture community calls it sheet mulching. It's been used for a long time. You can see evidence of that in archaeological digs all over the country. When you think of the peat bogs in Europe, a lot of that material was used for this type of gardening. And it's based basically on layering organic matter to create a medium for plants. And you don't really have to fixate on recipes. A lot of people take things so literally when they read these articles or these books, but it's a pretty forgiving technique for creating a garden. And you'll never be able to create a really large garden. It's really meant for small gardens. And it actually works best if you do a small lasagna garden and then add to it over time, or create another one. And you can build, different areas to work in your yard And it's great for urban gardens, and we'll have an example of that. So really what it does is it just uses some of the waste material, the organic material that you might have on your property or nearby. So one part of the country will have a different type of material to use than other parts of the country. And it's not a magic formula, it's just another tool for home gardeners to use. So, and why would you want to use it? It's a really nice way of creating a smaller garden without tilling. And a lot of us don't have tillers. I've been gardening in my yard in Warren for, I think, 32 years. In fact, before we even worked on the inside of the house, we were planting gardens and planting trees. So I've never owned a tiller. I've had neighbors come over and offer to till, but I've used methods that have really kind of kept that at bay. And I usually work on a garden the season before. In other words, I don't decide to have a garden in a spot in the spring and then go ahead and do that. I've usually worked a year ahead of time. So it's a great way to smother grass and weeds. And one thing that we have is a lot of grass, and we have really nice soil. However, it's mostly clay. So for years, I've been working on trying to get our clay soil a lot more friable. It's a really nice way to create gardens where you think about plant families and want to rotate different crops, families into different parts of your yard so you prevent disease. So you might grow in your lasagna garden the first year cucurbits, and that would include, squash, pumpkins, cucumbers, which love that really nutrient-rich material. And then you could go to your solanaceous crops like tomatoes and peppers. And then the next year you might use that spot for allium, like onions, or for garlic. And then rotate in the fourth year to brassicas. That would be cabbage, kale, things like that. So it's a really nice way to rotate plants and prevent some of the diseases that are prevalent in each of those plant families from one year to the next. So you're keeping it kind of clean. You use up organic waste, grass clippings, cardboard, kitchen scraps. I'm known at all the appliance stores for coming by and getting, whoops, I seem to have forwarded this a little bit too much. Sorry, I've got to go back. So I go to a lot of appliance stores and they see me coming. I get the refrigerator boxes. If you have a wet area in your yard, you can remediate that to a certain extent by building the layers up and keeping the roots of those plants out of that wet area. Of course, you can't control the weather. That doesn't always work, but it does work really well in a sandy soil. If you have a very dry spot in your yard, maybe a southern exposure, maybe it's got a little bit of drainage, it's a really nice way to keep some moisture in your soil in your garden. Here in Maine, we have a lot of ledge, especially along the coast and on the islands. And one of my things that I've done, and a lot of people I've met on the phone and by email, are people who are gardening on Isle of Ho, Vinyl Haven. And it's a real traditional method to, build up the soil out there on those ledgy areas with organic matter. So I've learned a lot from clients who've called. So sandy and clay soil can be improved. Over time, the organic matter becomes one with your native soil and can improve it a lot. Plants like squash and pumpkins, which we call heavy feeders, tend to really like this type of garden. And it's a nice way to prepare for perennials, trees, and shrubs I don't know if people are familiar with the Fedco catalog, the tree catalog, but they often recommend that you kind of think ahead before you plant your trees in the spring to prepare a site by layering material, kill the sod with some cardboard, and then put some material, including some minerals on top of it for a really nice start for that tree. So the materials that you want to use for building a lasagna garden would be, we think of it in terms of brown materials and green materials, very similar to your compost pile. And the ratio doesn't have to be perfect, but generally speaking, you'd want a 4-to-1 ratio, 4 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. And so here's a list of you know, some of the things that would be considered brown and green. One of the things that really surprised me when I found out about it is that coffee grounds, even though they're brown, are really full of nitrogen. And the nice thing about making lasagna gardens is that you don't have to compost your material. Like if you have kitchen scraps, you're doing a lot of canning in the fall, you can put those right on your built garden. So here's a photograph taken in the Portland area yard of some of the browns and greens that you'd be looking for. So you've got leaves, oak leaves can be problematic. You probably want to chop those a little bit. They tend to mat, but maple leaves are great. We've got newspaper. Somebody told me that the Wall Street Journal works better than the New York Times for some reason, but I don't think that's true. Straw is very expensive right now. The nice thing about straw is it doesn't really have very many weed seeds. And a lot of people do use spent hay. Spent hay tends to have kind of gone by. Sometimes it's pretty moldy, it's hard to breathe. But if it's spent, if it's been hanging around for a while, it does tend to not have as many weeds as fresh hay. And on the right, there's a tub there with this material in it, and I'm not really sure what that is. It almost looks like old cassette tape, you know, stuff, but it's not. It's something that this person in Southern Maine maybe has gotten nearby. Maybe it's salt marsh hay. Does anyone know what that might be? But she uses a lot. And then there's kitchen waste and a bunch of other stuff that's obviously quite green. So the substrate that you want to use, especially if you have grass, if you have really healthy grass, you really want to have a lot of the carbon substrate material on your to start your garden. And you can see on the left that there's 1 layer of cardboard. Well, I tend to do maybe 3 layers of cardboard, or a layer of really thick cardboard, and maybe 2 or 3 layers of newsprint, and I really lay it down. In the mid-coast, we have a native grass that people say bad things about. I hear a lot of those words. It's called quackgrass, and some people call it witchgrass. A lot of Mainers call it witchgrass, and it's a perennial grass with a very white rhizome. It's very, very hard to control. It's really hard to control in perennial gardens because you've got to get it out from inside of the roots. But in a vegetable garden, it tends to be a lot easier to control. But if you have quackgrass, it's really easy to identify with that white rhizome root, excuse me. And I would really layer your substrate if you do have that. So on the right, this is a garden in Portland, and I'll have examples of that entire process later in my presentation. But this gardener, she did a layer of cardboard, and her grass, she said, is very weak. And her grass is, unfortunately, her yard is kind of semi-shaded because of Norway maples, which create unbelievably dense shade. So her grass was somewhat weak to begin with. I think it was a lot of creeping Charlie and and a perennial and an annual grass that wasn't very strong. So she layered cardboard. Then there's that dark stringy stuff that looks like cassette tape stuff. And then she did newsprint on top of it. So her substrate didn't have to be as beefy as I would have had to do. Other materials that we have in this area, we're really lucky. We have rockweed. And so I collect rockweed in Rockland at the South Beach. I go up to Lincolnville. I've got one spot in Friendship that I enjoy going to. And this is how I broke in my new car. It was filled with sand fleas for about, they lived in there for 2 weeks after I collected the seaweed. On the right is a picture of a gardener I've been dealing with for years, who calls me every season and then calls me at the end of the season to give me updates. And she's even sent me copies of her poetry books, which I'm really, flattered by. But anyway, she's an incredible gardener on Isle of Ho, and she has to deal with a lot of ledge. So she's built up her soil over time with seaweed, among a lot of other things. As a caution, seaweed can really, really bump up some minerals in your soil, and I'm zoning out and I can't remember which one it is, but boron. So if you use a lot of seaweed, you can end up with a boron overdose in your garden, which some vegetables are very sensitive to, one of them being beans. So a few years ago, she had a hard time growing beans, and we got her to do a soil test, and it turned out that she's got too much boron in her soil. Before you collect seaweed, always get landowner permission. Generally speaking, I only go to, public access places. The nice thing about Rockland is that, their sewer system is working better. Their stormwater system is working better. So I don't feel funny about getting seaweed on some of the beaches there anymore. And only take loose material from above the high tide line. One reason why, and that's a legal thing, but one reason I do it is it's drier and it's not as heavy. So it's much easier on the back. Other material that would fall in the seaweed would be nitrogen, especially if it's fresher. A carbon source would be spent hay and fallen leaves. This material here on the left is at Crystal Lake Farm and Nursery, and that's where Sharon Turner grows a lot of food for her own use during the season, in addition to her plant nursery, by really layering newspaper and this spent hay along with chopped fallen leaves. And the production that they have is just incredible. You can see too that they use a lot of season extension. And not only does that warm the soil up in the spring, but it also keeps insects away. So their produce is very pristine. And on the right is just a typical compost pile in the fall. You can see there's, in the middle layer, there's some grass, and on the top there are leaves. And that's just like your compost pile, it's what you're looking for. So manure, which is sort of the miracle material, is one thing that you definitely want to only apply in the fall, and that is because of pathogens. And we recommend that you only use the manure that plant-eating animals would create. And so that excludes, of course, cats and dogs, never use that kind of waste, but also pigs, because pigs are, generally speaking, omnivores. And they do carry some pathogens that can carry on to people. So when you do use manure for a lasagna garden, One of the nice things about horse manure is that horse owners really spoil their animals, and they have sawdust, or more generally shavings, that they put in their stalls. And they're so meticulous about caring for their horses that they really end up with a pile, when they clean out their stalls, of manure and shavings that is really that ideal 4:1 or 3:1 ratio, 4 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. So it's a great medium in and of itself for certain types of lasagna gardens. So here's a little cartoony thing that I did for a kids gardening program a few years ago that just shows, like, you're layering it. That's why they call it lasagna. And you just do it over the season. I usually end up starting a lasagna garden in the summer as I pull up old plant material, or if I mow and I have some extra clippings, grass clippings, although I leave my clippings on the lawn because they're a source of nitrogen to the grass. But if I have too much and it's clumping, I'll collect that. And I have a substrate of cardboard, and then I might have manure that I collected the previous year, newspaper, that's carbon, chopped leaves, more carbon, or if they're fresher leaves, there's a little bit of nitrogen, cardboard, grass. So by the time the last layer is on there and it's late fall, you can really watch it start to sink, especially if we have a bunch of warm days. We've had chickens for 10 years, and I know that our chickens really love to stir it up, which probably helped a little bit. And by the spring, it's really a third of the height that it was earlier in the season. And by the time we plant in it, and usually the first year I only do seedlings and not seeds, it's just raised a tiny bit. So here's some examples of lasagna gardens that I've come across. I work a lot with a Master Gardener volunteer program at Bray Maple Farm in Union. And their garden is on a very gentle slope, south-facing slope. They use raised beds. Some of those raised beds are built partially with lasagna garden technique, but they have access, because it's a farm, to a lot of good material. And the farm is named after its beautiful sugar maple trees. So there's always in the fall really nice quality leaves for building up a lasagna garden. And of course, the nice thing is that they have some heavy equipment to do some of the big moving. There's about probably 22 volunteers that work here. Their primary goal is to grow food for food pantries in Knox County. It's a great crew. This is Frank moving a really disgusting ancient bale of spent hay, and the lower part of the garden for a number of years has been very wet. I think there's some springs there, as well as the strange weather that we've been having. So that lower area is where they've really developed some really nice lasagna gardens. And here's a picture of one of those lasagna gardens, full of really heavy feeding plants. On the left, there's some artichokes. Then there's a group of some sort of squash. It looks like it might be a zucchini. Then there's some melons, the plants that have the cut leaf. And then on the right, cucumbers. And this is at Open Farm Day, usually the third weekend in July. So that method works because this part of this garden is quite wet. The white stuff along the edge is just remay spun-bound polyester row cover. that they've taken off. And that was on there for insects. So here's an urban garden near Portland. This person, who's a master gardener in Cumberland County, did a really nice job taking like time-lapse pictures of her methodology and also some of the garden as it grew. And I really appreciate that she shared this with us. So this is the one I was talking about that had the weak lawn. Yeah, the grass looks really bad. That's okay, I hate lawns. I have a great lawn. I have like 15 acres on one side of the road, and then we have fields and 80 acres of woods on the other side. So I look at lawns as a lot of work. So this one is the one I showed you before, layer of cardboard, and maybe this is salt marsh grass. Maybe somebody in the chat or in the comments can tell me later what they think it is, because I know it's not cassette tapes. So there she has the cardboard or the newspaper on top of that material. This is a smattering of either compost, which she added for some biological activity, or coffee grounds. She might be one of these coffee ground collectors. There are quite a few of those people out there. And then she just takes stuff out of the garden. In the middle there, she was thinning her squash. We plant like twice as many squash as we should, thinking that maybe there'll be a germination problem or something. Well, then you end up with too many plants in one place. So she just yarned that out. It has no diseases on it, like it might later in the season. So it's great for your nitrogen layer. And then there was another layer of newspaper, and then a layer of straw. She uses straw, which is now like $9 or $10 a bale. But remember, it's compressed. So if you're doing a small garden, you're getting quite a bit of straw out of a compressed bale. And so she took some views from one of her windows above, and I really appreciate this. This was the following June. Things had gotten going. You can see there, nothing's in flower yet. I love her little grid that she has the squash growing up. It looks like it's flat on the ground, but it is a diagonal, slanted diagonal thing. Over here are, I don't know what that is, but that's a picture in June. She's edged the bed that she made the previous season. This must be for peas right here, maybe. And then this is that July. She's got some really nice lilies. The squash has gotten to this point. The tomatoes are happening. You can see that there's quite a bit of shade in here. Tomatoes are looking a little thin. And she told me too that she has better luck with things that don't really need a lot of light, like greens, which would be lettuce and chard and things like that. These things that really require a lot of light don't necessarily do well. She's one of these people that's probably trying to get her neighbors to either limb up or cut down their Norway maples, which are invasive anyway. So here's a simpler lasagna process for squash and pumpkins, which seem to really like the lasagna gardening soil, partly because there's a lot of phosphorus in that mix. They like a lot of phosphorus, they like a lot of nitrogen. So this is a garden that I did a few years ago, where I took a good thick substrate of cardboard. See, the grass is really healthy at our house. It's clay soil. Clay is kind of hard to work, but it has really good nutrient holding capacity. So that's why grass loves it. It really holds on to nutrients much more than sandy soils do. So we've got clay. So lots of newspaper. The manure went there the previous spring and it was quite nicely aged. The manure that I picked up and trailered over was really nicely aged already. Made the mounds, shaped them with my feet and gloved hands. It was kind of fun. And then I made little cups where I put some actual mineral soil that was from the Maine vegetable garden, just, a shovelful in that little cup. And then I planted seedlings. I hardly ever plant squash seeds directly because of the striped cucumber beetle is really aggressive on tiny little newly emerged seedlings before they get their real true leaves. So I usually plant seedlings that I've grown. They don't take long to get going. And then I kind of cheated, but it worked really well. I used bark mulch around those seedlings just to kind of hold moisture in. It was a dry year, and to keep weeds from growing. And I didn't really have very many weeds in this garden anyway. So that is that same year in July, you'll see that there are tomatoes growing behind it in a used piece of landscape fabric that I picked up from a greenhouse that was cleaning up their greenhouse. And in that area of the garden, I simply put actually there were holes in that fabric already. And I simply dug into that, amended the soil with a little bit of organic matter. I think it was a commercial compost blend. And I just planted those tomatoes directly into our native clay soil. And they did great. But the squash, I really wanted, I didn't want to deal with the grass. I didn't want to till. And I knew that they liked the environment that a lasagna garden creates. So that's in July, the end of July. I also plant late. Spring is really busy at work. So I always get the garden in, like, sometimes the 4th of July is when I plant our garden. And so that is around the middle of August. So the squash is doing really well. And you can see I forgot to prune my tomatoes as much as I should have. And this is this past fall, where I wanted to take that section. This had been what you saw those squash were planted in. And I don't want to plant squash in there again, because squash can get a lot of weird diseases. And I really don't like planting it in the same spot year after year. Similarly, I will not plant any tomatoes or peppers, anything in the Solanaceous family in this area this coming year. And so it's simply taking this nice, heavy duty cardboard. This is refrigerator box. There's more cardboard underneath that. And I was going to do the same thing, and that is that really nice horse manure with bedding in it for my neighbor, using my husband's labor. He's very helpful, incredibly helpful. I'm lucky that he's got a big truck and a trailer. And we are doing the same thing. We're just taking this small section and we are building it up so that I can plant squash and pumpkins in it next year. What I do is I grow about 350 pounds of Waltham butternut squash, which is a really nice squash for the food pantries because it has a thin skin. It's very easy to cook. It stores really well. And I can bring it to them when they need it. So it's a great squash, and it's also disease resistant. So that is what we did in the fall of 2021. for this year's garden. And this is a photo I took yesterday. So where I had, excuse me, squash, last year I planted garlic. Now, whether or not garlic is going to like this amount of organic matter is something I don't know. It was a really good variety called Music that I've had good luck with. So I'm hoping it'll do well. And then this spot over here is what you just saw us building last fall. And that's where the squash will be. And I think that I'm going to rotate these holes. I'm going to flip this fabric around so these holes are not in the same place. And that's probably going to be brassicas of some sort, larger brassicas like cabbage or some of the larger kales, and maybe some other things like flowers, because I love to have a lot of flowers in the garden to attract pollinators. So a lot of people ask when they do a lasagna garden, do I need to test my soil? Yeah, I would do it in the first or second season, especially if I was going to grow things that might be fussier like potatoes. And I would do it in the second or third season when that organic matter has settled into the soil, into your native mineral soil. One reason why I would do it is in the first year, your nitrogen tends to be high. Of course, we don't, in our normal soil testing, we do not test nitrogen. It comes and goes with the nutrient cycle. So most people do add nitrogen to their heavy feeding crops, especially like corn, things like that, and greens. You are going to have a high phosphorus reading. I don't know if you can see that bar on the right. This is phosphorus, but this was a lasagna garden and the phosphorus was off the charts. That's a tendency that we have with a lasagna garden, especially if you use a lot of manure. And potassium can be variable if you have built a lasagna garden. A lot depends on your soil, especially once those materials kind of merge together. Your organic matter reading, which is right there on this visual bar chart, that is going to be high no matter what. Usually we recommend for an in-ground garden that it be around anywhere between 5 and 8%. But with a lasagna garden, it's going to be high. Your pH may be above optimum for acid-loving plants. So if you're going to grow potatoes, which we recommend being a slightly more acid soil to prevent the plant disease called scab, your pH may be a little too high and you might have to do something about it, like add elemental sulfur. And it's always good to get a soil test if you're worried about lead in your soil. And a lead test comes with every soil test that you do, whether it's the standard test like this was, or a special test. So I do test my soil. I test my soil every 3 years. Part of the reason is I have a hoop house and that tends to get a lot of sodium buildup in the soil, but homeowners can benefit from it. And one of the things that we do is we have a copy of your soil test and we can help you read the results when they come in. And so that's it for my presentation. It's not nearly 45 minutes, but I figured there might be some questions around lasagna gardening, or most gardeners have a lot of questions in general. So
yes, and we do. We've had some come in already. And I invite folks to go ahead and type your questions into the Q&A, which is located down at the bottom of your screen. If you hover your mouse over, it should pop up your toolbar. You can also type them into the chat. It's just a little easier for me to keep track of them in the Q&A, but let's dive in. We had someone make a comment about, you mentioned the Wall Street Journal, and June says that historically the Wall Street Journal was the only big newspaper that used better quality ink that didn't come off on your hands. So she wasn't 100% sure about that. But
well, I do know that since I think it was 1979 that all newsprint and magazine print, they got rid of lead and cadmium in their inks. So we get a lot of questions about that. Is there lead or cadmium in my newspaper when I use it in the garden? And you do not have to worry about that anymore. I wouldn't use maybe coated paper, which has clay, a clay coating. I used to be in the print industry, and so that can mat, and you may not get moisture going through it, but any newsprint is perfectly safe.
So we had a couple people who actually specifically asked about the colored ink in newsprint, and that we've heard before that that's not desirable. That's still okay though?
It's still okay. It's soy-based, so no lead or cadmium like there used to be.
That's excellent. Really good to know. Okay, thank you. Nancy wanted to know how to use this technique in existing gardens.
Oh, I would do a soil test first to see what your existing organic matter reading is, and see where your nutrients are of the, especially the major nutrients, and go from there. But if it's about an issue that you're having, like, do you have clay? Is clay the problem? Is it too hard to work in the spring? Does it hold too much moisture? Is it caking after it dries out? Maybe you've got a soil structure problem, and it could be the way that you are approaching your garden, especially in early spring. Are you overworking it? Are you destroying the soil structure, the way it holds together? Or maybe there's another way to solve that problem, but I don't think there's ever a reason not to. It is a good way to smother weeds. Like if you've let your weed seed bank build up over a number of seasons, yeah, maybe it's time to kind of like do the lasagna gardening on top of it, but make sure you do it the season before. And that means sacrificing that growing season in order to build that area up.
Now, you had mentioned soil structure, and we had a couple people were asking questions about tilling, because you said a couple times that you weren't a big fan. Can you talk a little bit more about why tilling can be problematic?
It can be problematic because you're breaking apart all the material that holds the little aggregates together, and you really want those there. Once you till, you add air to your soil, you're breaking things up, and you might be losing some of your nutrients. You might be losing some of the properties that you want to keep, like its ability to hold moisture, if it's sandy soil, or the ability to drain if it's clay soil. So, and I find that tilling can also, home gardeners sometimes, you know, if they take a vacation or if they've got visitors, they let their weeds go. And most farmers don't do that. So if you have a home garden and you've let your weeds go, when you till, those tines are bringing up weed seeds that might be like 10 or more years old that come to the surface and germinate. So I see a lot of people doing that. So they think they're tilling, wow, it looks great, it's so nice and clean. And then it rains and you've got this incredible flush of weeds. So
a beautiful weed garden.
Yeah, if you want to avoid weeds in a home garden, tilling can sometimes be surprisingly good for those weeds.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we had some questions about the manure, and Susan wants to know what you think about chicken manure.
Chicken manure is an incredibly high source of nitrogen. So yeah, it's great. It's really disgusting to handle especially if it does not have a lot of bedding in it. It's strong smelling. We usually suggest that if you want to use chicken manure in your garden, to add it to your compost in layers and really compost it before you use it in your garden. And in all this, I never mentioned once that we do have a very active compost pile that we do use. I don't even sift it anymore. I just add it to my lasagna garden situations, or I might bury it. But chicken manure is very high in nitrogen, and you can burn things if you're not careful.
Oh.
And you would never want to use it in the season that your plants are growing. You use it the season before.
Okay, that's very helpful to
Yeah.
know. Susan wants to know if you have any tips or instructions for how to chop leaves.
Yeah, what I do is maple leaves I don't chop because they're so fine and nice to use. That is sugar maple or red maple. Norway maple, which is the non-native maple that tends to take over suburban and urban areas, that has more lignin in it, and oak leaves have even more lignin in it. That's the woody substance in the leaf tissue. And what I do with those sometimes is I'll just drive over that area with a lawnmower once, and then I'll rake it and use it. And some people have leaf choppers, or they have a chopper, but I wouldn't buy a new piece of equipment just to do that.
Just mow it.
Oh yeah, and you know what works really good is some people will put their leaves into a hopper or a cage, and they'll put a weed whacker in it.
Okay.
And that's a good chopper. Yeah.
All right. We have a lot of questions, so I'm going to go through.
Oh, and one thing about chopping leaves.
Yeah.
One thing about chopping leaves with brown-tailed moth being a problem, handling oak leaves can be a problem. So just be aware of whether or not you have a sensitivity. I'm very sensitive to brown-tailed moth, and when I do those sorts of activities, it's really embarrassing, but I wear a Tyvek suit if I'm really into those leaves. And if it's really hot, wearing a Tyvek suit is really miserable.
Well,
so brown-tailed moth is a different subject.
Yeah.
That I should probably not go into.
We'll get a lot of comments about people who can commiserate, though, I'm sure.
Right.
Nancy wanted to know, does when you were mentioning squash, does that include summer squash in the?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yep. And summer squash is great because you can get at least two plantings, succession crops of summer squash in a lasagna garden, because it's just a perfect medium for them. They just love all that phosphorus. And so if you like zucchini, and you can plant early, get a plant to produce, and then do, succession plantings of zucchini, especially the bush types that don't take up a lot of room. And similarly, the summer squash, the yellow crookneck, or the, I really like Zephyr, which is the yellow one with a little green nose on it. That's a beautiful summer squash.
Getting hungry with this conversation. I haven't had squash for a while. Nancy wants to know, is above optimum organic matter a problem?
It can for certain things. If you live near a body of water, phosphorus is the problem nutrient that creates the green stuff, algae bloom. So if you have a ditch near your garden that drains into a lake or a stream, you probably really want to be aware of that. And you can use, hay bales. If there's a heavy rain, you can get runoff. Just be really aware of that. Some plants, like carrots, I can't seem to grow carrots, which have to be direct seeded, into areas that I've recently made a lasagna garden. It could be the texture of the soil more than the phosphorus. And I could find out more about that, but I have very little luck. It's been also very dry. It's carrots take a long time to germinate, and it's been dry in the spring, especially last year.
Jane wants to know, does this work well in other parts of the country and in hot climates? And I'm thinking Jane's asking about Texas. So,
oh, Texas.
Yeah,
it's really a good thing for, it's a very, very good thing for sandy soil because organic matter can really help sandy soil retain some moisture. The tricky thing would be to find the nitrogenous material, the succulent things that provide that nitrogen. So that would be the question, and grass clippings could be the answer to that. And manure could be the answer to that.
All right. We have a ton of questions here. I'm going to just keep plowing through as best I can.
Gardeners always have questions.
They
You
do.
just do a Q&A thing, and that it would be, yeah.
But it's all really good information, good questions. So Deb wants to know, I thought if cukes, melons, squash, etc. were planted together, they may cross and affect results. It seemed they were planted beside each other in your photo.
Yeah, and remember that when you have a cucumber or a squash, and squash have different families. There's Cucurbita pepo, Cucurbita maxima, and yeah, you can have those two together. But if you're saving seeds, watch out, because anything in the same grouping, like two different varieties of maxima, can cross, and it's in the squash fruit that you may want to save the seed from and plant next year, that you're going to get that mystery plant. But you're not going to worry about the fruit you're getting this year, because the seeds that you get from your supplier, if you plant that, you're going to get Waltham butternut, or you're going to get Zephyr summer squash, because they're breeding them, and they're breeding them in isolation, or they're doing manual cross-pollination, or they've got row cover so that pollinators can't get in there. So if you're saving seeds, yeah, it can be a problem. But for the fruit that you get that growing season, no problem.
Okay.
It's confusing.
But you can get Frankenstein squash.
Oh yeah, but that's fun. And that's why this is why you get these weird things in your compost. Those squash seeds that you that were in your compost from last year, that grow in your compost this coming year, maybe something really weird, or it could be a gourd.
I love those surprises.
I do too. I keep them, and I use them for I keep them for, decorations or something. And sometimes they're true, and sometimes they're good to eat.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're bitter.
Okay, so Susan wants to know, what type of services and workshops does the Extension Service offer in this area? So Mid-Coast Maine.
Well, we have been in the pandemic mode. So we've transitioned, even our Master Gardener Volunteer program for the 2020-2021 season was all online. But if you go to our website, which is down here, our garden and yard program, we have done countless numbers of webinars, including a really, really nice series that we did called The Victory Garden for Maine. And we did that for beginner gardeners. And the reason why we did it for beginner gardeners is that in the first year of the pandemic, everybody was growing a garden. People who had never done it before, people who moved from Boston or New York up to Maine, people who were worried about their food source.
Right.
So if you go to our website or just Google Victory Gardens for Maine, you're going to see a 10-part series of really, really basic gardening videos for beginner gardeners. And it focuses on vegetables, but a lot of the information can really apply to people who are interested in growing ornamentals. soil, watering, choosing your plant, planning your garden, thinking about your garden the season before. It's really a very nice, it's a really nice series. And then we've also done a lot of advanced training for our Master Gardener volunteers. And we've done a lot of really nice programs with the University of New Hampshire on all types of things, including a series on houseplants, which is a first for us.
It sounds like fantastic resources on the website.
So as much as I love doing local programming, we haven't really been able to.
Yeah.
And this year I'm focusing on doing some workshops for our 2001 Master Gardener class, because we haven't really met them yet.
Mm-hmm.
And we haven't done anything in the field. Normally our classes have a lot of hands-on activities. And of course, these folks were on the computer all the time and on Zoom calls. So we really want to focus on them. But we do have a lot of material online, and we put everything, upcoming webinars that we do, we put them in all of our local newspapers, and they're at our garden and yard website too.
Thank you. That's a great resource to have. Maria says, have you heard anything about wax components in cardboard boxes, especially Amazon boxes? Wouldn't that affect soil and food quality?
I know that if you're an organic grower, you have to be very aware of the types of cardboard that you use. So if you have a certified garden, if you're certified with MOFGA, you already know that. Although most home gardeners don't go through the certification process. It's usually just commercial growers that do that. I am conscientious about removing tape and staples. That's what I do. In my toolkit, I have pretty big pliers that have needle nose that take staples out. And I always have a big ball of, I end up with a ball of tape when I go. Some boxes are taped a lot more than others. But I haven't really, as a home gardener, been that concerned about the quality of the cardboard. In fact, I've never really seen wax boxes except for vegetable boxes, which I don't really use that much of. I don't think I have used.
Gloria wants to know, can you mention anything about pest problems, mice, rats, chipmunks? Do they get into the lasagna garden beds at all?
They haven't gotten into the lasagna garden because I think the layers are so thin, but yes, we get a lot of calls about rodents in compost. And one of the reasons why, especially in the fall, people call about rodents, and schools that have compost systems, that's their biggest concern. And we do help them with that. There's warmth. That's one reason why they harbor in there. It's not just the food. And we do recommend that if you do put any meat scraps in your compost, that you take the time to make a hole in your compost pile or your bin and bury that stuff in there. And then cover it with what we call a biofilter, which would be a source of carbon. And that prevents the smell from attracting, coyotes or mice. But I do think, unless it's a closed system, that you might have critters.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Diane wants to know, how many layers of cardboard do you use in the lasagna garden?
Well, that's a really good question. If I have quackgrass, which is that native rhizomatous grass with a white root, I might do, 4 layers. Luckily, a vegetable garden is an annual type of garden. Well, there are vegetables like asparagus and stuff that are perennial. Quackgrass tends to be more of a problem in a perennial system. And because it just comes back no matter what, and weeding it is hard. I get a lot of questions about ornamental gardener's nightmare plant, and that is goutweed, also called bishop's weed, there's so many names, snow on the mountain, blah, blah, blah. Any amount of cardboard is probably not going to stop that. I would not put a lasagna garden on goutweed. It just, goutweed would win.
Mm.
I know people who have moved because of goutweed.
Amy says, I have raised rows. Can you successfully do lasagna layers in rows? And which manure, horse or cow, creates fewer weeds?
Yeah, rows would be cool. I wish I had a photo of that. I saw one a few years ago that I took pictures and then I couldn't find pictures of it, but yeah, beautiful, beautiful garden. Rows would be fine. Yeah, why put nutrients in your walkways?
Mhm.
You know, why waste the material, and why, you know, when you have good soil in your walkways, you're gonna have to weed your walkways. Anyway, so yeah, you could do the lasagna method in a row system, especially if you have those permanent aisles for maintenance. What was the second part of the question?
With horse manure or what was the other one? It was
Cow.
horse or cow, which would create fewer weeds?
Well, cows have a number of stomachs, so they, when they digest, are really, really killing weed seeds. Much, much better than horses. Horses digest one time and then it goes through them. They're not really efficient grazers. So horses tend to have a weed called hairy galanzoga, which is, at least it's an annual. It, you know, you can with persistence eliminate it from your garden. The nice thing that I like about horses is that when you get the material, it's already mixed with bedding.
Right. You
It's
mentioned how nice that is.
Fabulous 4-to-1 ratio. And because lasagna gardens are built up, you know, those weed seeds, you know, if you see one, you're probably going to see it. It's fresh material. It's not like your soil that's got a history of weed seeds. And an example of hairy galanzoga is those seeds can remain in your soil for 40 years.
Wow.
And still be viable. And when you till that and it comes up, it's happy, it's going to grow.
Well,
So horse manure is like, if I had and I also have just plain old in-ground gardens for vegetables, especially greens, for small seeded plants like carrots and greens, and things like brassicas where I'm direct seeding.
Mhm.
Mustard and stuff, I tend to just grow in my garden, which I've added organic matter to. And if I was going to add manure to that, I would seek cow manure, but good luck finding it, because a lot of the commercial composters have first dibs on it. And they're using cow manure to create the commercial compost that you buy in bags or in bulk.
June wanted to know, she has a pile of 10-year-old plus horse manure on her property, and she wanted to know if you thought it still had enough good nutrients left in it to make it a good candidate for adding to the garden.
Yeah, if anything, you know, it's not just the nutrient quality that you get out of organic matter, you're getting a soil conditioner.
Okay.
So even if a lot of rain has made most of the nitrogen go bye-bye, nitrogen also volatilizes up into the atmosphere, so nitrogen does not stick around. So yeah, it's great. And if it's composted for a long time, the benefit is that you've probably lost a lot of the viability in those weed seeds.
Rosanna wants to know if you can use lasagna gardening where it's very wet and can get standing water in the spring. Is that an okay spot?
No, I wouldn't use it for standing water unless you want to build up the soil nutrient level for kind of a rain garden, or for certain plants that don't mind standing water. Like I have a number of ditch gardens on our property where we have slopes, and I try to keep, we have a cottage, and it's on the upper part is on a slope coming out of a field, and I've created ditches where I have water loving plants like blue flag iris and Joe Pye weed and Monarda and things like that. So I would plant the appropriate kind of plant for that garden. And if you go to our Yard and Garden website, we've got a whole section on plants for the Maine landscape. And there's this great list from our Garden Pro Answer book, and it gives you plants for wet areas, plants for dry soil, plants for full sun and dry soil, plants for part shade or full shade, and blah, blah, blah. So if you want to know what kinds of plants that like, standing water, I don't think anything in the vegetable family is going to be happy with that.
Rosanna wants to know, what about doing this in planter boxes? If you started in the fall, could you get it to work by spring?
Yes, but a lot of people will do a lasagna method in a raised bed.
Okay.
I don't know how big her planter boxes would be. But if it's a pot, a large pot, one of the things that I always do is when I'm putting seedlings into a pot for like an ornamental, like for, planters that I want to have in the front yard or something, flowers, I will always add a certain percentage of really good quality compost to the potting mix for biological activity and holding moisture and stuff like that. So whether or not you could do a lasagna garden method in a smaller pot, I don't think so. I think the things you're going to plant in there they're going to have their roots are going to really need to spread out.
Right. Which wouldn't be conducive.
It would be restrictive maybe to them.
I'm just going to go to about 2 more questions, and then there's a few people who typed in some things that aren't really related to the lasagna gardening. So I encourage you, I'm sorry, we're just, pretty over, so we don't have time to get to those questions. I apologize. You can go ahead and email Elizabeth, though. Her email is right up on the screen there, and I'm sure she can help you out with those questions. I did want to mention, so Maureen says that she's used this method to build perennial beds with great success. She's also made a couple of shrub borders, and in that case, it's better to use very small plants or dig a hole in the soil through the cardboard. She mentions that Crystal Lake Nursery in Washington sells small shrubs for reasonable prices. So it's nice to hear that Maureen's had some good success with the lasagna gardening. And Laura asks, do you also sometimes add native soil to the lasagna garden to help add microbes, etc., to the mix?
Yeah, I had a photo earlier of the lasagna garden where I planted squash seedlings, and I made small cups in that of native soil from my garden, which is pretty rich, mostly clay. And I felt that that was a better spot to put those little squash seedlings because I didn't want them to go into transplant shock. I didn't want them to get just overwhelmed by the amount of nutrients in that manure material. So yes, I did for those. And I didn't do it. I did it out of caution, but it worked really well.
Well, thank you so much. And again, Laura, Debbie, I know you have a couple more questions, but we're running a little long right now. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it back to Deborah, who's going to talk a little bit about the Camden Garden Club once more. And I thank you all for coming. We've learned so much this time. All right, Deborah, your turn.
Oh, I want to thank Liz for her presentation and the great photos she used to illustrate the lasagna method of gardening. So many great questions. This is just great. And I believe this is a sign that people are ready to see warmer days and have the need to get their hands dirty in their gardens. And I'm definitely one of them. So just a reminder that more information about the Camden Garden Club, go to camdengardenclub.org. And of course, we really appreciate Julia and the Camden Public Library for hosting the Garden Club's Winter Horticultural Series this year. Thanks so much, Julia.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you, Liz, and thank you to everyone who's come out to all of these. This has been a tremendous learning experience. And Liz, I think you hold the record for most questions asked during one of the horticulture talks. So.
Yeah, I'm glad I'm used to it. And if people have questions, feel free to send me an email. That's definitely the best way.
Well, I hope we can have you back again for a future talk. And folks, I encourage you to check out what's going on at the Camden Public Library. We're doing lots of talks still, even after this series ends. You can find everything coming up by visiting librarycamden.org and our What's Happening calendar for adults. And again, Deborah, Liz, and everyone out there, this has been a great series, and I look forward to seeing you all in the future. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.